So, good morning everyone. I'm Kristen Forster and this is my daily blog, Crumbs under the table, walks with my dogs and sharing some thoughts as we go. I've decided this morning to kind of hang out in this cool spot. So I thought this morning that I'd try and get out before it got too hot. I got out before 8 o'clock, but it was still too hot. So as we got to the, this is quite a nice pool that the dogs do like swimming in, and I thought this will give them, if I stand here, anyone who watched my my broadcast yesterday, you notice that I don't have the sense to turn around and go back when things get painful. I walked through a horrible kind of overgrown area of nettles and brambles and so on, and so the truth is that my calves were zinging for the rest of the day. Seeing as I was wearing shorts. So that wasn't the smartest thing, which probably means that the content was not quite so sharp, because I was smiling as I went, and although I didn't show you too much of my face because perhaps it wasn't smiling, I was grimacing. But anyway, I'm gonna settle here for today, and you can enjoy watching the dogs kind of go in the pool from time to time. So let's turn this around. So I thought what I'd do is I'd kind of go back to the subject I was touching on the other day, which is kind of, if you like, people's backstories, particularly the writers and the eyewitnesses of the Gospels and so on. We did a kind of one of Simon when it was pouring with rain, of course, which then got cut short as I was trying to move and stop myself getting soaked. But this morning I thought we'd touch on John, and that's always a slightly more complicated situation, because there's a little bit of ambiguity around the character of John in my mind. For some people it's easy, and the reason is because you can resolve the understanding of the character of John in a couple of different ways, which are all satisfying from a narrative point of view. And so it's not that you can't work out who John was, it was actually that you've got a couple of options, and they're actually all good. See, in terms of what I wanted to do in terms of understanding how God takes someone's background and understanding, they kind of come together anyway, because they're one of the things I have consistently in all of my solutions to who John is. See, it seems obvious, you'd think, wouldn't you? So, well, John obviously, John the Apostle, well, that's true, and actually the earliest church fathers record relates to John being John the Apostle. But then Eusebius, who comes a little bit later, says no, actually he is a guy called John who was a disciple. And instantly I would side with Irenaeus being earlier, and he has less of an agenda, it seems, than Eusebius. But there are some elements within the Gospels themselves, which is always important, which kind of would kind of sort of give me an inclination towards the Eusebius solution. So emotionally, I'd want to go with John the Gospel writer is John the Apostle. It's nice and simple, and it allows for certain kind of readings of the connections of kind of some of the discussions of Jesus with James and John. Because actually there's a very high probability from the text that not only is that they're also related to Jesus. That's the thing I was going to get. So you get a very kind of personal kind of connection. But the bit that kind of stands a little bit outside of that is there's a strong tradition in the early church, which includes how did the gospel get written, which are very non-equivocal on the fact that John is a priest. And it tells us that as a kind of an eyewitness report, someone who's there with John, and how he was the John who wrote the gospel, who was there at the Last Supper. You say, well, what's one of the 72 doing? Well, it doesn't say it was only the 12. It talks about the disciples and so on. Actually, no, I think it does say the 12. But so Richard Balcombe is a New Testament scholar, says he thinks that John would be the host in this situation. He proposes that John is the host, and it's not a bad solution. Who is the owner, therefore, of the upper room, which is how come he gets involved in this evening, and he is someone who's known in the wider circle. He's part of the 72, etc., etc. But that tradition, that I didn't quite finish about him, tells us that he was a priest, and more than a priest. It uses the phrase he wore the petalon. I always want to say peloton, but that's to do with cycling. which actually means if it was literal, it would mean he was an exceedingly high priest. But I suspect that it's not supposed to be used literally. It's a bit like when we use the phrase in English, who wears the trousers in your household, which is that we're not necessarily supposed to see it as a kind of a literal statement. It's more of a metaphorical statement. So a priest is obviously someone who is officiates, and there's a lot of priests in Jesus' day. To be a priest, you only need to be descended from Aaron. You don't have to have got the right job. But not only that, he is a priest who does officiate. And if whether it's literal, i.e. he really did wear the breastplate, which would probably mean he was a very senior priest, or whether it's metaphorical, because we find that phrase used, for instance, of James, the leader of the early church. So obviously he doesn't seem to be a priest at all, unless, of course, he's not James. Yeah, I'm not going to go there. I was going to discuss the nuances as to whether James and John are actually that James, who we often refer to as the brother of Jesus, is a euphemism for actually James the apostle. That's another possibility. I'm going to leave us out of that one. It's not particularly an interesting discussion, but the point is, it says of James in one of the early church writing that he officiated with the petal on. Now he's not a priest at all, but he is leading the church. So they're kind of, you can see how the language is being used of priesthood now for those who are leading the church and officiating within the church. So it may just simply mean John, but then you have to say, so if that bit's metaphorical, but the first bit seems more literal in the way it's given. So John, the gospel writer, he was a priest, and he wore the petal on, i.e. he suddenly has some status within the new church, a bit like James, or does it mean he really was a high priest? Any of those things is fine. So we're thinking about how how God uses people's background and so on. And so anyway, the tradition around how John's Gospel gets written is fascinating. I keep flashing out, I notice, with the light under here, of course. Every now and again the light kind of comes through. So maybe what we'll do is let's walk up here a little bit. The dogs will like that because we're staying near the water. So yeah, what was I just saying? Yeah. So, but the key thing, therefore, and of course that makes sense because John, the gospel writer, in his gospel talks about how he's known at the house of Annas, and if you weren't a priest, and potentially even a relatively senior priest, it's difficult to know how you'd be known. There's a tradition that that Peter and James, John, and Andrew, their fishing business, their cooperative, have contacts down in Jerusalem, and even if John was a more minor priest, therefore he might have served the house of Annas as both a priest and a fisherman, that kind of thing. That's good. It all works. But what was I just saying? Oh yeah. So it does make sense to me, both of the gospel, the way the gospel is written, and so on, that John is this priest. Let's assume he's the Apostle John at this stage, because it doesn't really affect my argument. So what? To come back to the oh yeah, that's right. I never finished. So the early church tells us that that after some of the apostles have been killed, which now means it's probably about mid-60s, because Peter and Paul have been killed in the mid-60s, executed in the mid-60s. That those who were together at Ephesus, I think it was Ephesus, maybe in Antioch, decided that they needed a kind of, if you like, a supplementary gospel, one that, well, because there was loads of things, as it says at the end of John's gospel, there's more than you could ever write, and it kind of feels like Matthew's gospel, which is the official kind of authorised gospel, has set the tone, which has been kind of certain incidents from Matthew have been picked up and expounded in Mark, which is a reflection of Peter's preaching. It's the way that the early church puts it to us, which means that we get more of the eyewitness detail of Peter rather than, if you like, the more generic, these are the events that you get in Matthew. So Mark's gospel complements Matthew's gospel by kind of filling in some of those details. It doesn't really add any new information. Luke's gospel has been written to travel with Paul, and it's been written for a Greek-speaking audience in the churches that are being planted around the Aegean. And at that stage, we have now 3 Gospels, and there's a decision that there ought to be this 4th one to fill in some of the gaps. And in particular, the gaps are the stories down in Jerusalem. And so they intend to write it together, which is how they've done Matthew's Gospel, of course. I say, of course, that's in the way I teach it, which I think is correct. That's why I teach it that way. So they originally intend to do it together, the surviving ones. And it's after a night of praying, they decide that John should write it on their behalf and they should all endorse it. And so you get that little bit at the end of John's Gospel where it talks about, and we all confirm these things and we affirm these things. But the thing is, as I said, the reason I wanted to draw out this kind of way in which the Lord uses our backgrounds and so on is John's Gospel is so written from a priestly perspective. It's actually written also from a very philosophical one. And it is reflecting, if you like, the current peak of Judaistic messianic thinking. But it's more than just it's more than just Pharisaical. And I use the word Pharisaical not in a condemnatory way, because the Pharisees were, if you like, the popularist Bible teachers of their day. And so in that kind of context, you can see them popularly. In many ways, Jesus teaches like a Pharisee. There are other bits that he teaches where he seems more a scene. I think he doesn't fit into any one particular camp, although as often been pointed out, there are things that definitely he cites and endorses Pharisaical conclusions. But that's probably because the Pharisees were kind of trying to take Scripture most seriously. But John's Gospel kind of draws from a much wider tradition within Jewish thinking. And I've touched on this before, how he draws from the contemporary work, it seems, of Philo. Whether he's read it or whether just as a priest he's been in the same sorts of discussions that Philo has been in. But Philo isn't, he's not a Pharisee. Philo is a Hellenized Jew. He writes very philosophically, and we find a similar kind of tone. So to the degree that there are those that believe in a late writing of the Gospel of John that will say that John copied Philo, Philo writing in the 40s, which is always true, even if it was written early. But I think it's probably simpler to say, it's been pointed out, that it's kind of almost to assume that Philo exists in a vacuum, which he clearly doesn't, because he is just drawing together threads that have been part of the debate in rabbinic circles for over 100 years. And so when John starts with, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God," he is bringing a kind of crystal clear clarity, which was just being achieved in the top kind of academic circles of theological and religious thinking, that had just kind of come to a point which I sometimes refer to as a sort of proto-trinity, a proto-trinitarian view, where it saw God in his Word and his Spirit as all being active together, there being an aspect of God that was beyond anything in creation, but his Word and his Spirit who are active in creation. And so those things kind of, as I say, form a proto-trinity within the kind of this top level of thinking within Jewish thinking in Jesus' century. And John seems to be a part of that. And so he then clarifies it and then takes the next logical step, which is, actually, we've experienced this in Jesus. So that Word and that Spirit, which the rabbis have come to that conclusion about, which is not created because they come out of God, so they somehow express who God is, and yet at the same time they seem to have an independence from God because of the way that they respond and react, and we can know them and experience them in this world. So Abraham met the Word of God, and the Spirit of God grabbed Ezekiel by the hair and lifted him up. So we can experience the Spirit, we can experience the Word. And so John takes that next step and says, and his name's Jesus. He dwelt among us. He became flesh, he dwelt among us, and his name is Jesus, and I'm going to tell you his story, which is the story of John's Gospel, in a very short nutshell kind of a way. And so it's just another kind of illustration of those wonderful things, which is there's probably a whole amount of stuff in the background of John as the Gospel writer. And whether he's John, who's part of the fishing cooperative too, because priests had to have their own jobs unless they were part of the ruling class, the Sadducees, right there in the temple. So it's not a contradiction to say that as a priest he would still need a job to kind of pay his way, but actually it's given him the privilege of kind of taking a little bit of time to stop and reflect, to read and discuss, and be involved in the kind of deeper discussions. And as a result, as he draws all of those things together, he then kind of, whether it's metaphorical rather than physical, he wears the petal on, in that he becomes, if you like, the chief minister within a church situation, particularly at a time now when Paul is dead and Peter is dead, and so perhaps John is emerging in that kind of key way, in a similar way to James, who has the same phrase used of him in Jerusalem as he steps into that place. And you can see how his background and history uniquely equip him to give us a different perspective on Jesus. It's not a contradictory perspective, but it is a different one. It's complementary, and without it, our understanding would be so much impoverished. I'm a very big fan of Matthew's Gospel. I think it for me is the richest Gospel. If you like, it is the cake, and without it, our knowledge of Jesus would be very insubstantial. But people think they like John's Gospel best. In fact, I've thought that often. But that's because John is the kind of like the bits of fruit and the jam and the cream in it. It's kind of, whoa, that is, without that it would be a very substantial cake, but it would be a dry cake. No, dry is not the right word. But John somehow adds that, that gives a whole new meaning to every incident. And the ability to write like that, and the ability to communicate that, and the ability to kind of draw out very differently from Paul, who's coming from a much more Pharisaic kind of tradition. So Paul studied under Gamaliel, and he brings out some brilliant insights that come via revelation, as we thought about the other day, that he is able to kind of see, and that the Lord is able to communicate through him because of his background and thinking. But John, on the other hand, is giving us kind of this very abstract, philosophical, Christological view. If you like, it's the metaphysical view of what the gospel is all about. And there's a very practical, pragmatic, earthed on the ground view. We mustn't lose that, and don't want to run that down. As I say, that it's first established by Matthew, then it was given extra detail, were filled in by Mark, and if you like, a broader perspective was brought by Luke. But now John brings, if you like, a whole new veneer. And we see things very differently through him. So those are just kind of my thoughts. It's just I love to get behind the characters that you read about. John is very clear. One of the things he does is he's very clear on who all his eyewitnesses are in every point. I won't bore you with the details now. And so actually one of the things that's quite nice is to understand that these are key characters whose perspectives we want to understand. And so actually it's interesting to find out a bit about them. So maybe as the days go on, we'll think a little bit about some of those other eyewitnesses that we find in John, people like Philip, Nicodemus, and so on. So anyway, that's my thoughts for the day. I'm not going to do too much else now. I'm going to turn it around. We've stayed here. I'm going to walk back towards the easy access to the pond, see if the dogs want to go in. See, yeah, look, they're heading back there now. And and so what we'll do is we'll see if we finish with a nice shot of the dog splashing into the water, which is always a pleasure from my point of view. I was thinking, I wish I could join them on a day like today. You going in? Anyone going in? Banjo? Luna, you going to go in? No, maybe not. Okay, well maybe then it's just time to say proper goodbye, and we'll start heading home, and I'm probably going to get a shower. Okay, so see you tomorrow then. Bye.